Thanks everyone for joining us today. My name's Caitlin Cusack. I'm a forester with the Vermont Land Trust. And Savannah, if you want to forward the slide. Savannah, can you, there we go. All right, excellent. Awesome. So thanks for joining us today to hear about the future of hemlock in Vermont. We are lucky to have two really knowledgeable speakers that are going to share information with you. We have joining us Savannah Ferreira, who is a forest health specialist with the Vermont Department of Forests, Parks and Recreation, who has been really deeply involved in developing a conservation plan for hemlock, and she'll share a lot of her knowledge. So ask good questions. And then we also have VLT's own Peter VanLoon, who is the lead forester here at the Land Trust. And he'll be sharing also his knowledge and work over the years, particularly being in the southern part of the state. So if you're not familiar with the Vermont Land Trust, if this is your first time engaging with us, we're a membership organization dedicated to protecting farmland, forest land, and community lands across the state. About 11% of the land in Vermont is protected under a land trust conservation easement. And so I thought I would go over a couple of just Zoom basics before we jump in. We will, both Savannah and Peter will answer questions at the end of the presentation. But as we go along, as your questions come up, if you could enter them in the Q&A, which is at the bottom of your Zoom screen, that helps us keep track of them a little bit better than entering them in the chat. And then if you need closed captions, those can be enabled by selecting that button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So with that, I will turn it over to Peter.
Thanks, Caitlin, and thank you everybody for spending a little bit of your lunchtime with us today. And I really want to thank Savannah for generously giving us her time and knowledge and expertise on this effort as we try to educate folks a little bit about hemlock and hemlock woolly adelgid. Caitlin didn't mention that she is also very knowledgeable, and I hope she'll pipe up with answers too when the Q&A comes if she's got more to add. Hemlock's a really important part of Vermont's forests, as you're about to hear. In fact, it's a keystone species, which means it creates a unique ecosystem around itself. And when it's removed from that ecosystem, it's likely to collapse. Because of hemlock's outsized value to wildlife and water quality in Vermont, and because we have an interest in so much of the land, with conservation easements on over 600,000 acres, we feel like we really have a responsibility to do education and outreach on issues like this. We've been doing work on hemlock and hemlock woolly adelgid since 2012, when we offered hemlock woolly adelgid surveys to all owners of conserved land in Windham County, and unfortunately we found it everywhere we looked. And since then, we've done webinars, first detector trainings, and local hemlock woolly adelgid workshops and surveys. And this webinar is the next installment in those efforts. And we are so grateful to have Savannah here to help us along. So with that, I will pass it to you, Savannah.
Thank you for having me here today. I'm really excited to talk about hemlock. So although the main point of my talk, or what I'm going to talk about most today, is hemlock woolly adelgid, did I just lose the sharing? Can I get confirmation that I'm still here?
Yeah, Savannah, you're still here. We can see.
Okay,
yeah, we can
awesome.
see your screen.
Sorry, I lost all of the Zoom on my screen. I just want to set the stage with a reminder of hemlock's importance. So eastern hemlock is actually a native tree to North America. It spans from Canada to northern Alabama and Georgia, and it's actually present in 29 US states. This is a slow growing tree that can take anywhere between 250 and 300 years to reach maturity. And we do have records of it living more than 800 years. So eastern hemlock is shade tolerant. It does prefer to grow in moist and well-drained soils. So you'll be able to see hemlock in your stream valleys, your swamps, and typically on northern and eastern mountain slopes. Here's just a picture showing where that range is in North America. So, like Peter said, eastern hemlock is considered a foundational species in our eastern forests, and this is because it's locally abundant and regionally common. So, hemlock structure and functional characteristics create microclimates and habitats for a range of species, and this includes, but is certainly not limited to what you see here, like white-tailed deer, snowshoe hare, porcupine, brook trout, salamanders. Now, the northern extent of eastern hemlock's natural range coincides in a great part with the homelands of the various Abenaki peoples. This slide is a brief and partial compilation of Abenaki cultural relations with eastern hemlock, and it was actually provided by the Attawai Project. So there's several ethnobotanical uses known that include infusions and teas to treat rheumatism, itchiness, and scurvy. Hemlocks have high tannin in their bark, which can be used as a tanning agent as well as dye materials. And then its dense foliage was actually used to add comfort to bedding and protection to shelters. Among the Abenaki, hemlock is a participant in intersectional communities, and their presence and health lead to the presence of other medicinal and otherwise significant organisms, such as the partridge berry that really enjoys hemlock's dense overstory, and hemlock reishi, which is specific to eastern hemlocks. So eastern hemlock is also significant to Vermont's economy. Eastern hemlock is one of the most abundant tree species in the state. It's actually the 7th most prevalent tree species, and it has a total estimated stumpage value of about $186 million. Now, though it does rank 3rd in species by both saw timber value and growing stock volume, hemlock products are typically in lower demand than our other softwood species, mostly due to its uneven texture. It gets ring shake, and it does have a pretty robust lack of decay resistance. So there's still a few markets for hemlock. This can include pulpwood, mulch, dimension lumber, as well as construction and landscape timbers. But also important, hemlock provides several non-market values. And this includes wildlife habitat, ecosystem services, like water filtration, oxygen production, carbon storage, and then recreation. And for Vermont, tourism is one of the largest industries in the state. We gross about 13 million visitors each year. And although not all tourism in Vermont is centralized around eastern hemlock stands, when you lose a keystone species, you can see rippling effects on the ecosystems. So in forest types where eastern hemlock is the least prevalent tree species, the loss of the species is going to probably have a minimal overall impact on the economic significance because it's going to be replaced by more locally abundant tree species. But where you have habitats where hemlock is the dominant tree species, or it's really significant in the area, that loss of species is going to lead to a forest cover type shift. And this is going to significantly start reducing both market and non-market values. So now that you know why hemlocks are important, we can talk about why trees, and more importantly for this presentation, why hemlocks decline. So this is my favorite picture in the pathology world. It's called the disease spiral, and it was written by Mannon in 1991, never updated, but I use it in every presentation. Because trees just don't die one day. There's a variety of factors that contribute to a tree's overall mortality. So this is a great tool to show how your abiotic and biotic factors actually compound each other to speed up the rate of decline and eventual mortality. So first we have predisposing factors. And this is this outward spiral here if you can't see that yellow circle. This is usually an abiotic or non-living stressor that stresses out the tree and then reduces the ability of the tree to be able to withstand injury or a biotic, which is living, like insects and diseases, attacks. Predisposing factors include, but are certainly not limited to, genetic potential, poor soils, climate change, and air pollution. In Vermont, our hemlocks have shallow root systems, so they have low moisture holding capacity, and they're facing climate change. So both of these things are stressing out the tree. The second spiral in this picture, which I'm going to highlight in orange, represents inciting factors. Now, this can be abiotic or biotic, so non-living or living, and this is usually an event. So this causes the first symptoms of decline. This could include things like defoliating insects, excavation, drought, frost damage. In Vermont, we've had recent droughts. We've had outbreaks of hemlock looper, hemlock woolly indulgent feeding, as well as elongate hemlock scale feeding. So these factors have the potential to greatly reduce the tree's health and vigor, and then make it more susceptible to other pests and pathogens. So contributing factors, which I'm highlighting in red here, is the last spiral and represents further damage to an already stressed and low vigor tree. Opportunistic insects and fungi can more easily establish and thrive in weakened hosts. So an example of this in Vermont is going to be our native hemlock borers. Now, it is possible that trees can die from just inciting or predisposing factors. This is just a tool to show how things can compound if a tree is able to survive these stressors. So, for example, as climate change increases, the stress it's causing to the tree is also going to increase. We may face more droughts, and therefore we could see trees die well before they're ever dealing with these other factors. So let's switch gears and start talking about hemlock woolly adelgid. Now, unfortunately, hemlock has been in a state of decline in the United States, especially in the southern regions for the last several decades. This is primarily due to the population explosion of hemlock woolly adelgid, which is an invasive sap-sucking insect that was brought into the eastern United States, into Virginia in 1951, and then into Vermont in 2007. Hemlock woolly adelgid is primarily dispersed by birds, but it's also able to move by wind and then much longer distances with human transport. Now, this is a picture, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but this is a picture of an adelgid without the white flocculence, which I'll explain in a few more slides. But they're pretty soft. They can get really squishy. And during the winter months is when you're going to see this white flocculence, and I'll show better pictures in a few slides on the branches themselves. So here's a map of the distribution of hemlock woolly adelgid in the United States, as well as where it's found in Vermont. So on the map to the left, notice that hemlock woolly adelgid is spanning almost the entire southern range of eastern hemlock, but lucky for Vermont, it's actually only in the lower 3 counties. So again, here's what hemlock woolly adelgid looks like in the field. For the majority of the winter and spring, you're going to see these white cottony balls on the undersides of hemlock branch tips. This insect is black most of the time, but this white woolly flocculence is a covering that they create themselves and then put on top of themselves in order to protect them from predators as well as harsh weather or extreme temperature fluctuations. Once an infestation is established, you're going to look for yellowing needles, premature needle drop, dieback, and thin crowns. Hemlock woolly adelgid can and will affect all stages of hemlock, and it can kill trees within 4 to 12 years in New England forests. This is actually much shorter in our southern forests. So eastern hemlock has vulnerabilities to several abiotic, which again is non-living natural disturbances, including drought, wind and fire, which contributes to having an adaptability score of 2.7. So this is actually the 3rd lowest score of all Vermont native trees. So in summary, eastern hemlock is just not predicted to do well with climate change. With climate change, we're predicted to see increased temperatures, increased rainfall, and an increase in extreme weather events across the country. So the increased temperatures is going to allow for higher rates of evaporation and evapotranspiration and cause an increased need for water. This is going to reduce soil moisture and stress out the tree. Rainfall is also expected to increase. However, it's going to be large amounts of rainfall in a short amount of time with extended periods of drought between events. Droughts are going to be a contributing factor and again lead to tree decline. We're also likely to see an increase in extreme weather events like the flooding that we saw this summer, fire and high wind events. These can damage and stress trees, decreasing hemlock's overall health and vigor, and then making them a much more suitable habitat for other insects and diseases to become established. So if you look at this picture here, this is what's called a migrating state climate example, and it's showing what Vermont's temperature and humidity might feel like over the next century. The red arrow is a high emission prediction, and the orange is a low emission prediction. So if we have low emission progression, our summers are actually going to start feeling like the summers they experience in Ohio and West Virginia. However, if it's a high emission progression, it's going to feel like Tennessee and Alabama, which is significantly different than the summers we're experiencing now. So if we switch gears back to hemlock woolly adelgid, again, here's the current distribution of hemlock and hemlock woolly adelgid in the eastern United States. And when we compare that to the distribution state migration map I just showed, you can see that over the next century, our Vermont climate is going to be more similar to the climates where hemlock woolly adelgid has been infested for longer periods of time, meaning that more of Vermont is actually going to become more favorable habitat for hemlock woolly adelgid. So what may be becoming apparent is that winter temperatures are currently limiting the spread of hemlock woolly adelgid in both New England and in Vermont. The exact temperatures are still being researched. One study has shown that temperatures up to 23 degrees does limit the spread of hemlock woolly adelgid. And although it does reduce the population spread, they're still able to prove that much colder temperatures are needed to kill those cold tolerant adelgids. The same study showed that temperatures between -14 and -13 could significantly kill off a lot of the hemlock woolly adelgid, but again, a reproducing population still remains viable. But when you get down to temperatures between -22 degrees and a -33 degrees for at least 2 hours, that's when you're going to see the most hemlock woolly adelgid mortality. So this means that new infestations and populations are going to likely be found following years with mild winters. So as a state, we do winter mortality population surveys to see how many hemlock woolly adelgid have died. According to our historic data, we needed to see about 90% winter mortality to prevent range expansion. And as you can see over the last several years, winter mortality has been well below this threshold of 90%. I mean, the last time we hit 90% was in 2018 with 94%. However, this year was a little bit more optimistic with 79%. Hemlock woolly adelgid is much more efficiently killed by these sub-zero temperatures, but there's also newer research that's starting to look at the temperature fluctuations that we see in February and March during sugaring season, as well as summer mortality that might be killing otherwise surviving hemlock woolly adelgid before they're actually able to reproduce and spread. So although we're not seeing the winter mortality numbers that we were hoping for, we're also not seeing a really fast progression in the distribution and range expansion in Vermont. So as a state, we do annual hemlock woolly adelgid surveys in non-infested towns and counties to delimit the known infestations, especially when we see these low winter mortalities. We also have a few long-term monitoring sites in infested stands where we observe canopy measurements just to see how fast hemlocks are actually dying from hemlock woolly adelgid in Vermont. In 2023, we actually added a town to our infestation map, which is Windsor, Vermont, which is on the northern leading edge of our infestation in Windsor County. Now, unlike most invasives, we do have a suite of tools to help manage populations. I'll discuss the following three. We have insecticide treatments, and this can maintain the health of infested high-value trees, but they don't provide long-term protection, and it's really important to keep in mind that treatments need to be repeated. This isn't going to be a one-time deal. We have biological control or biocontrol agents, and this is a reduction of pest populations using natural predators. The goal of biological releases is not necessarily to eradicate hemlock woolly adelgid, because that's just considered impossible in the United States at this level of infestation, but to establish a self-sustaining population of biocontrol that will improve hemlock's health and vigor by lessening the impact that hemlock woolly adelgid has in infested areas of Vermont. And the picture to the right here, which I'm going to talk about in a couple slides, is our Laricobius nigrinus biocontrol releases. And then the third is cultural practices, and this is going to include both urban and forestry practices. So let's start with horticultural oils. So this is a topical contact pesticide that kills soft-bodied insects such as adelgids by suffocation. This is typically chosen as a non-toxic or low-toxic alternative to other pesticides, but there is conflicting information in the scientific literature about the consistency of its control for other hemlock pests, such as elongate hemlock scale. To be effective, horticultural oils need to cover the entire plant. So this typically requires the use of specialized high-pressure equipment, and as soon as the horticultural oil starts drying, it's no longer effective. The most common insecticides for hemlock woolly adelgid management are neonicotinoids, and this includes both imidacloprid and dinotefran. So imidacloprid is widely used for hemlock woolly adelgid control. It is highly toxic to insects and other invertebrates, and its residues can last for months to years in the soil. This is a systemic insecticide and it's slow acting. So it often requires about 3 months to observe any mortality to hemlock woolly adelgid, and then a full 2 years following that initial application to see the full treatment effects. Because it has slow movement within the plant, it's not really effective for our scales, including elongate hemlock scale. Dinotefran is another commonly used neonicotinoid, and this is used for both hemlock woolly adelgid and elongate hemlock scale control. So this insecticide actually has much higher water solubility than imidacloprid. And this allows just for greater mobility and a quicker action in trees than imidacloprid. So this insecticide is not as long lasting because it has such high water solubility. And it's only typically effective between 1 to 2 years after application, but you can actually start seeing results in about 4 weeks after your initial application. At the time of this presentation, Vermont does allow the tank mixing of imidacloprid and dinotefran for basal trunk applications to take advantage of the quick uptake of dinotefran and then the long efficiency of imidacloprid. The application method of these insecticides are going to vary on site conditions, such as soil characteristics, accessibility, and then proximity to sensitive resources. Hemlock woolly adelgid does have several biocontrols available for use in the United States. The 4 insects that are on your screen that are highlighted in black, they have a black box around them, are actually native to the United States. And then the ones that are not boxed are native to Japan, where hemlock woolly adelgid originates. In Vermont, we release Laricobius nigrinus, although we do have naturally occurring Laricobius rubidus. And Laricobius rubidus is included under hemlock woolly adelgid biocontrol because it's a sometimes predator. Laricobius rubidus is much more effective at controlling populations of pine bark adelgid and balsam woolly adelgid, but it's included with hemlock woolly adelgid because it hybridizes with our Laricobius nigrinus. So they're able to mate after we release Laricobius nigrinus into an area, and then their hybrid will consume some hemlock woolly adelgid. So as a state, we've had little success in establishing a Laricobius nigrinus population, but we have been releasing it since 2012 at 4 towns in southern Vermont, and those are listed up here. This year, we had about 377 Laricobius adults released at Jamaica, and we didn't do any recoveries this year. And we are hoping to have another shipment come in sometime in late winter. We are at the mercy of the breeding labs to send us Laricobius nigrinus, which is why our releases vary from year to year. There's also several effective measures that can be used to manage hemlock woolly adelgid in your ornamental yard trees. Reducing abiotic stressors on hemlock can increase the overall tree health and vigor, so allowing the tree to have more resources should hemlock woolly adelgid become established. So if you're choosing to plant hemlock on your landscape, you can look for hemlock woolly adelgid resistant varieties. Hemlocks that are infested with hemlock woolly adelgid should not be fertilized with nitrogen because this is actually going to boost adelgid populations and be more detrimental to your tree. If you do have an infested tree, you can reduce the number of adelgids and scale if it's there by actually pruning out infested branches. Again, mechanical cutting is not really an effective forestry management tool, but it's great in our urban forestry. If you're choosing to do mechanical cutting, this should be done between August and February because this is when adelgids are less likely to spread. When possible, it's always best to leave these debris of infested hemlocks on the site. If you're chipping it, That doesn't really eliminate hemlock woolly adelgid, but the surviving insects aren't going to live for a really long time. But the best things to do are cutting the branches and then burning them if it's safe to do so, or if it's not safe to do so, bagging the material and either solarizing it, so leaving it out in the sun for so many hours until the internal temperatures get too hot, or bringing it to your local dump completely bagged where it can't escape. Other best management practices in your urban settings are going to be cleaning off your vehicles, clothing, and other tools when you visit properties with infested hemlocks. And then one of the most important things we can do in our urban landscape is actually removing residential bird feeders between April and August, just to reduce those bird vectors, because hemlock woolly adelgid, again, is vectored by birds pretty easily. So where hemlock woolly adelgid does not occur in your forested stand, there's really no need to alter your current forest management in anticipation of the insect. However, it's always important to keep in mind that just because you don't have it now doesn't mean you're not going to have it in the future. We do recommend keeping a hemlock component if possible, and then trying to keep, like similar to your urban setting, a high vigor and low stress hemlock component. Because these significant disturbances, maybe you hit it with a skidder, maybe it got damaged when you were felling another tree. This is going to cause tree stress and help predispose it to biotic stressors, including hemlock woolly adelgid. We don't recommend preemptive cutting in anticipation of an infestation, just because there is some known genetic resistance to hemlock woolly adelgid. And if you just panic and start cutting hemlocks, we're going to remove those genetics from our landscape without knowing if they were actually beneficial to us. So when you're managing hemlock woolly adelgid in infested stands, harvest and removal should be planned again between August and February, when hemlock woolly adelgid is least active. Depending on your stand composition, you may need to prioritize invasive plant management. And this is just because invasive plants are really going to take advantage of those newly opened canopy gaps. We did recently publish a management guide for eastern hemlock conservation, and in it provide 3 silvicultural strategies, which include your passive management, a light selection or shelter wood, and then a high intensity cut. But I'm not going to get into the weeds too much about those today, but they are available online if you are interested in learning more. One thing I want to talk about with removal is how to identify target trees for removal, and this can be in both urban and forested settings. So when your tree has a live crown ratio of less than 30%, that's when you want to start removing hemlocks, because they're really unlikely to rebound and going to continue to decline. So if you have a tree and it has 10 feet of green foliage, that's what its whole crown is, and then a couple years later, there's maybe 30% or maybe like 2 to 3 feet of green foliage on what used to be a 10-foot crown. Those are the trees we're talking about. That's less than 30%. That's what should be removed. If you're trying to remove hazardous trees or maybe recuperate some timber revenue, you should be planning these removals when you have about 50% live crown ratio. So about 50% of their foliage is still green. So another part of our conservation plan is talking about possible replacement species. So in forested settings where hemlock stands are in heavy decline from hemlock woolly adelgid, and where you're not able to apply any chemical or biological controls, it's important to try to initiate regeneration as quickly as possible, because hemlock provides so many vital ecosystem services that we want to try to maintain. If possible, establishing another conifer species with a similar functional niche may better mimic the microclimate effects, but it's really important to remember that if you're not replacing an eastern hemlock with another eastern hemlock, you're not going to replace all of the ecosystem functions that hemlock provided. It's always more cost effective to manage for species that are already present on your site, but where that's not possible, you should consider supplementing with natural regeneration with underplanting. So attention should be made to promote conditions that favor the establishment of desired and then also appropriately adapted tree species. So the right tree in the right place. So I did want to try to start winding down this presentation on a more uplifting note because I know that it can feel like a lot of doom and gloom. So the state has worked with Camcor, which is a seed collection company. And back in 2009, we actually were able to send them a lot of eastern hemlock seeds. And then they took those seeds and germinated them outside of known hemlock woolly adelgid infestations. If and when we get hemlock woolly adelgid back down to manageable levels in our landscape, we hope to be able to replant those seedlings and have the genetics back in the state. Another uplifting thing is we're working with the public to identify and maintain hemlock refugia. So refugia are areas that are buffered against dramatic environmental change because of maybe weather patterns or site characteristics. These could be riparian areas, the north-facing slopes, lake edges, cold air drainages, or seeps. Landowners that would like assistance with the classification of hemlock natural communities and landowners that may have these rare hemlock stands should fill out and submit a natural community survey form, which is found in our management guide. And landowners that do have old forests and or state significant communities and are enrolled in UVA may actually be able to have their hemlock forest enrolled as an ecologically significant treatment area. And then lastly, as part of this conservation effort, we wanted the state to serve as a model for hemlock conservation. So the state of Vermont is designating Jamaica State Park, Boseman State Park, and West Mountain Wildlife Management areas as hemlock conservation focus areas. This is going to serve as a demonstration forest, which applies various silvicultural, chemical, and biocontrol techniques described in our hemlock conservation management guide. And these state lands were actually chosen to be focused areas based on their score using a Vermont hemlock prioritization tool, which again, sorry, is found in our guide. And it's going to be used just to conduct field tours and then showcase different conservation strategies based on their management goals for the public. So here's my contact information if you wanted to reach out. If you think that you've seen hemlock woolly adelgid in Vermont, please report it. You can reach out to myself directly by either cell phone or email, or you can put in a report at vtinvasives.org. I also get these reports, so it will come to me one way or another. And then I know we moved really quickly today due to time constraints, but there is a lot more detail available in our recent management guide. And I just wanted to show you what the front of this page looks like so you could take down the title and Google it for yourselves, or I can send out a link after this webinar for those who are interested. And with that, Peter, unless you have anything else, we could take questions.
Yeah, thanks very much, Savannah. We don't have any questions at this point. I will say that based on one thing that we always do with our webinars is we send a follow-up email within a day or two to everybody who's attended, and we have a whole list of resources that folks can use to follow up and gain a little bit more information. And we will have a link to the guide within that resource email. So keep an eye out for that. We have a question here from Terrelyn. How do you determine an infestation in Vermont? Our forester identified hemlock woolly adelgid and our forest in East Burke. Boy, that would be interesting to confirm.
Yeah, so if you wanted to send that on the photos or a sample to vtinvasives.org reported feature or to me directly, I would be able to confirm whether or not that is hemlock woolly adelgid for you. And that's reaching out to myself or anybody on the forest health team with the state is completely free. So submitting a sample to us is always free. And we're really interested in knowing where it is, even if it's on private land, and you won't be charged for that.
Great, thanks, Savannah. The next question comes from Ari, and curious about using neonics on hemlocks in the forest. Given the wind dispersed pollen, what's the risk to pollinators?
Yeah, that's actually a great question. So the risk is lower, but still there. Hemlock pollen is not really sought out by a lot of pollinators. it's wind dispersed pollination for hemlock. So it's not really using bees, but the risk is still there.
Great. Len would like to know, on the slide on hemlock woolly adelgid predators it showed that there were a number of predator releases, but seemed like few or none of them were present in follow-up sampling. He just wants to see if he was interpreting that slide right.
Unfortunately, yes, we've had very little success. Some other New England states, such as Maine and New Hampshire, are starting to go away from Laricobius nigrinus for that reason. It's possible that we're at the northern leading edge of its cold tolerance. These are from the Pacific Northwest, so although it does get cold, it is still a different climate out there. So we're hoping in the future, as terrible as it sounds, as climate change progresses and we start seeing warmer summers and warmer winters in Vermont, we might actually see a better population establishment of these predators.
I have a follow-up question to that, if you don't mind, Savannah. When you do the releases, is there a certain time of year that you're releasing them?
Yep, so we release them around this time. It's anytime in the winter. Some of them start coming in about November, but usually by January, February, we've received the last shipments. So as soon as we get them in the mail, we run out and release them immediately.
Yeah, great. So let's see. Deborah would like to know if infected branches are removed, is burning them an effective way of disposing?
Yes, it definitely is. Because I work for FPR, just want to put it in a plug that if you are burning, you need to get a permit from your local fire warden. But it is a really great way to get rid of infested branches.
And April says you mentioned underplanting where hemlock is growing and wonders if you have suggestions for what species to underplant there.
Yeah, so here's an example of a few. We have white pine, balsam fir, white cedar, some larch. In our management guide, we actually have a pretty robust table. I think there's about 12 different possible replacement species. All of them are evergreens except for our eastern larch, which are deciduous conifers. And it will go through and talk about the pros and cons of each one, as well as what wildlife is going to use it, what ecosystem niches, or do they overlap with hemlock, and then what's their risk to climate change, what's their risk to other insects or diseases. And then that's something as a land manager, you or your forester would have to make that decision. The state's not going to say that we should be replacing eastern hemlock with X, Y, or Z, because it's really a site-specific decision.
Yeah, that's a really good point. You have to make sure that you match the species to the site. So I think that's the end of the questions, unless there was something that was put into the Q&A that I haven't seen yet.
Anna, I have a follow-up question if I could ask. I am curious about like sort of natural resistance. And I remember hearing a while ago about sort of these bulletproof stands. I'm just wondering if you could talk more about sort of some of the research into the resistance and sort of what we're finding and yeah.
Yeah, so I don't have any information in Vermont as of now. Although we've had hemlock woolly adelgid infestation since 2007, and the grand scheme of tree life, that's actually a very short amount of time for a state to be infested, even though we're coming up on 20 years here. So if we look back down into our southern states, like in the Virginia area, was 1951 is where hemlock woolly adelgid came into Virginia. There's a lot of research going into breeding eastern hemlock woolly adelgid resistant trees. And that's usually by private universities and the U.S. Forest Service. So it does exist until hemlock woolly adelgid becomes more established in Vermont, as it starts creeping up north, that's when we're going to start seeing, oh, we have hemlock woolly adelgid in 3 surrounding towns, or maybe properties, but none here. That's where we'll start be able to cherry pick resistance. But right now, 2007 in Vermont is just too young of an infestation to notice any resistance yet.
That's really interesting. Thanks for that, Savannah. And you make a good point that hemlock woolly adelgid has been down in the southern Appalachian region for much longer, and they've been doing a lot of research down there, and we really benefit from that. One of the things that a couple of researchers down there, Bob Jetton and Bud Mayfield, looked at was the effect of increasing sunlight on hemlock trees. And they found that if you thinned around them very lightly, those trees, at least in upland situations, actually seem to do a little bit better. And their theory is that the increased access to light makes them a little bit more vigorous and helps them be a little healthier. And all this research is fairly new, so we don't really know if that vigor will allow them to survive HWA or hemlock woolly adelgid, or whether it'll just survive a little bit longer. But even if it's just that, it may give us a little bit of time to help try to figure out a slightly or a permanent solution to HWA. So we'll have a couple of resources in the follow-up email if people want to read about that kind of stuff.
Yeah, that would be great to share, because one thing that we started to fall into, especially as we were writing this hemlock conservation plan, was the lack of New England specific sites. So in Virginia, they're putting out a lot of information. However, where hemlock mortality or widespread hemlock mortality is really just becoming a problem in southern New England right now. And again, it's going to work itself up to us here in Vermont. So Massachusetts can't do the same silviculture as our lower mid-Atlantic states just because it's a different climate. So trying to adapt and learn, but also pivot and make it more New England based. I think we're going to see some really great research and some really great projects come out of the next couple of years regarding hemlock.
I don't see any other questions unless any of the other panelists have things. I guess we could wrap it up. Oh, wait, there isn't one more. Just came. How effective are insecticidal treatments versus potential health impacts on the environment? So I guess looking for a cost-benefit analysis there.
Yeah, so it's really situational. The pesticide applicator is really going to have to take into consideration their site characteristics, if they have any at-risk habitats or maybe organisms that might be impacted. If you have these high value trees, they can knock down populations of hemlock woolly adelgid and elongate hemlock scale. The combination of imidacloprid and dinotefuran is typically what's used when you have both of those, and it is pretty effective. But you're going to have to repeat treatment, so every 2 to 4 years, depending on which neonicotinoid you're using, which can be costly. So it's up to the landowner. And this is typically going to be in an urban setting to weigh those of being, this is a really high value tree. Maybe it's a really good seed source. And I want to keep it for that reason. But if it's out in your forest or next to maybe a really important watershed, those are probably going to be outweighed really quickly of maybe you shouldn't treat those trees just because of the area that it's in and the impacts it could have on the ecosystem.
Yeah, great advice. Thank you. Caitlin, anything you want to add?
No, but I do see, Peter, another question to come in from Will.
Oh, just came in. Yep.
Yep.
Can you speak more to the mortality rates related to low temperature?
Of hemlock woolly adelgid?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, so let me just sneak back to this side so you can see. We are still trying to pinpoint the exact temperature that's needed to kill otherwise surviving hemlock woolly adelgid. But if we can get down to these -22 to -33 for about 2 hours is when we're starting to see the most winter mortality. However, we're not seeing a lot of range expansion in Vermont. So like I said, even though we've had the last couple of years have been well below this 90% threshold, we have a new town in Athens, which was already surrounded and it was just likely overlooked in 2022. And then in 2023 was in Windsor, which is on our northern leading edge. But if you just saw this graph, you would expect it to be the whole town, like it's moving 2 towns a year north, but that's just not what we're seeing. So there is more research going on to looking at our temperature fluctuations that we see in the wintertime during sugaring season. So when you get really warm days, when the sap's flowing really nicely and then it freezes at night, that these hemlock woolly adelgids are able to warm up enough and then have to go back to being kind of cold tolerant, that they're not able to make that shift. And then secondly, in the summer, when you have drought stress on trees, and really warm temperatures, hemlock woolly adelgid does go into a dormancy or an estivation period during the summer. And sometimes they're not able to snap out of that. It's kind of like a hibernation period. And we're hoping that although climate change is not looking great for us in the long term, that we have these little short-term wins of killing otherwise surviving hemlock woolly adelgids. And the state is looking at summer mortality. I didn't share those graphs with you today just because we only have 2 years of data, so I don't have a nice bar graph or any trends to show you. We had about 54% mortality for a hemlock woolly adelgid this summer, which isn't great, but it's 54% more than we thought were dying. We thought that if it wasn't getting killed in the winter, that it was living for the full year. So it's nice that, 79% died, and then of that remaining, 21%, another 54% of that died. So we can see this compounding mortality event over time.
That's really interesting. Thanks, Savannah. So Caitlin, anything else?
Yeah, so I think if there aren't any more questions, we'll wrap it up. Thank you so much, Savannah, and Peter, for taking time today and sharing your wealth of knowledge with everyone. As Peter had mentioned, we will send a follow-up email with lots of resources, and please reach out directly to any of the speakers with any follow-up questions. If you are around on January 18th, I would share that that's our next webinar, and we're going to focus on another non-Indigenous forest pest. That is the emerald ash borer. We'll host Paul Catanzaro. We'll share about strategies for preserving ash and mitigating the impacts of the emerald ash borer. So we hope you'll join us then. And in the meantime, wish you all a Happy New Year.
Thanks, everyone. And thank you, Savannah. That was really great.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.